Washington at the Constitutional Convention personified what Jeff was saying before. Jeff said that what makes the National Constitution Center special, is it brings people together across ideological lines and partisan lines so they can talk. And that's what Washington did at the Constitutional Convention. That convention was a train wreck waiting to happen. And it was George Washington that held it together. It's often said that James Madison is the architect of the Constitution. Well, if James Madison was the architect of the Constitution, I contend that George Washington was the general contractor. And any of you who have ever built a house know that the architect has a plan, but the general contractor sort of makes it work. And that's what Washington did. And he did it partly by his comportment. John Adams, who was always jealous of everyone, including George Washington, later said that George Washington was the best political actor he had ever seen. And we forget that about George Washington. We make him like a wax figure sitting up there or on Mount Rushmore. But actually, he was a great retail politician. He wasn't a great public speaker because his teeth weren't very good. But he was a great retail politician. He talked with people. And the whole time he was in Philadelphia, he stayed in Robert Morris's home, which allegedly was the finest home in Philadelphia. And he could have dined there every day. But he wanted to continue to work with the delegates. The delegates were crammed into the taverns and inns, Mary Daly's Inn, the other inns here in Philadelphia. And they would tended to eat in club at the various taverns and inns here in Philadelphia. Washington would go with them on difficult days. He would go and eat with the delegates and talk with them. Indeed, my favorite is the day that the convention almost broke down over the nature of the executive, because Randolph and Mason were insisting on a three-member executive like the old triumvirate of ancient Rome, because they thought giving too much power to one person will lead to a monarchy and a tyranny. And that night, Washington goes and eats with the delegates and talks with them, the man who would be that king. And the next day, the states vote 7-3 for a unitary executive, and they never look back. They trusted Washington. So he was involved. He was brokering the compromises. He was working on the compromises. And he was voting. He didn't speak because, as a presiding officer in those days, just like the Speaker of the House today, he doesn't speak during the debate. So he couldn't engage in the regular give and take. But he always voted. He always voted. And you can trace his votes, you can follow his votes, and you can see how they put together. Indeed, his vote was so important that his own state ends up splitting. His five-member delegation splits after George Wythe has to go home because his wife's dying. And two of them vote against the Constitution. Washington cast the deciding vote in Virginia so that Virginia approved. We're not talking about ratification now. We're approving it here in Philadelphia. Virginia, Washington's vote was needed. That and so many times for Virginia's vote. So we can follow his position, so could the other delegates. He was also talking with them at night, often at these dinners. There were also high society teas often in Philadelphia, hosted by the ladies of Philadelphia. And Washington was always, he was the lion of the season. He was the honored guest. And he circulated widely in those. And in those settings, he helped broker across ideological lines, pulling people together, broker this convention. That's why I call him the general contractor of the Constitution.